Did Johnny Carson believe some people were genuinely evil? For 30 years, Carson avoided moral judgments on air. He didn't sermonize, he didn't expose, he didn't play prosecutor. His role was to entertain, not to condemn. And yet, behind the scenes, Carson was far more discerning than audiences realized. There were guests who unsettled him, not because they were difficult or chaotic, but because he sensed something darker: manipulation, exploitation, a lack of conscience. Carson rarely spoke about it publicly, but when he did, his reactions were unmistakable. These are the 11 guests Johnny Carson believed crossed a line far deeper than bad behavior. 1. Jim Bakker. When Jim Bakker appeared on Johnny Carson's radar, it wasn't as a curiosity, it was as a concern.
Well, guess who is back on television? Jim and Tammy Bakker.
Carson had little patience for hypocrisy. But what disturbed him most were people who weaponized trust. Bakker, the televangelist who built a media empire through the PTL Club, represented something Carson found uniquely troubling: not mere dishonesty, but calculated exploitation. On the surface, Bakker presented himself as genial, humble, and devout. That presentation worked on millions of viewers. It did not work on Carson. Carson grew up around preachers. He understood religious performance. He could tell the difference between belief and salesmanship. To him, Bakker's broadcasts felt less like ministry and more like theater. Emotion carefully engineered, urgency manufactured, donations framed as moral obligation. According to staff members, Carson watched Bakker's rise with quiet skepticism. He rarely commented publicly, but privately he questioned the ethics of soliciting money from vulnerable audiences under the guise of divine necessity. What unsettled him wasn't ambition, it was intent. Carson believed Bakker knew exactly what he was doing. When scandals surrounding Bakker eventually surfaced, financial fraud, abuse of power, and deliberate deception, Carson was not surprised. Behind the scenes, he reportedly remarked that Bakker wasn't a man who lost his way. He was a man who built a system designed to profit from belief. That distinction mattered to Carson. In Carson's moral framework, incompetence could be forgiven. Weakness could be understood, but deliberate manipulation, especially of people seeking hope, crossed into something darker. Bakker's actions didn't just betray faith, they monetized it. Carson never treated Bakker as a figure of ridicule. And he didn't mock him after the fall. He didn't turn the scandal into punchlines. Instead, he distanced himself completely. Bakker was not a story Carson wanted to revisit lightly, because to Carson, the damage was not abstract. It was human. Viewers lost savings. Families donated money they couldn't afford to give. Trust was broken on a massive scale. To Carson, that was the definition of moral failure. Staff later recalled Carson using unusually strong language in private conversations when Bakker's name came up. Not anger, but disgust. The kind reserved for people who understood the consequences of their actions and proceeded anyway. What makes this case significant isn't that Bakker fell. Many public figures fell. It's that Carson never viewed him as misguided. He viewed him as intentional. In a career where Carson avoided labeling anyone outright, this was rare. Bakker wasn't chaotic. He wasn't unstable. He wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. And in Carson's eyes, that made him far more dangerous than any guest who merely lost control. 2. Charles Manson. Johnny Carson never met Charles Manson on The Tonight Show. That absence is the point. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Manson became an unavoidable cultural presence. His crimes horrified the nation, and his persona fascinated the media. Talk shows, magazines, and documentarians competed to put him on display. To many broadcasters, Manson represented grim ratings potential. To Carson, he represented something else entirely, a line that should not be crossed. According to staff members and producers, multiple suggestions were floated over the years about referencing Manson more directly or exploring his notoriety through discussion segments. Carson rejected them consistently. His reasoning was blunt. Manson was not misunderstood. He was not a curiosity. He was not a cautionary tale in need of amplification. He was dangerous. Carson believed Manson thrived on attention. Not fame in the conventional sense, but visibility itself. Being watched, being discussed, being centered. Carson understood performance psychology well enough to recognize when someone fed on the gaze of an audience, and he refused to provide it. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly referred to Manson as someone who would use the camera as a weapon. Not metaphorically, literally. Carson believed Manson manipulated belief, loyalty, Hickory identity with chilling precision. He did not see madness alone. He saw calculation layered on top of instability. That combination disturbed him deeply. Carson had hosted controversial figures before. He believed in conversation, but he also believed in responsibility. Giving Manson a platform, even indirectly, felt to him like complicity. Not education, not inquiry, complicity. This was not a moral panic response. Carson wasn't squeamish. He had covered war, scandal, and tragedy throughout his career. But Manson represented a different category, a figure who blurred the line between criminal and cult leader, using language and charisma to override moral boundaries in others. Carson believed some people should not be centered. That belief shaped his silence. Unlike later eras, when notoriety itself became currency, Carson's worldview was rooted in containment. He believed media could either diminish harm or multiply it. In Manson's case, he believed amplification would do the latter. Staff later recalled Carson using unusually stark language when Manson's name arose. Not fear, not outrage, something colder. Carson did not view Manson as chaotic evil. He viewed him as purposeful. And purpose to Carson made all the difference. By refusing to engage, Carson issued his verdict without spectacle. No segment, no discussion, no fascination, just absence. In a television culture increasingly drawn to darkness, Carson chose restraint, and in doing so, he made clear that there were figures he believed did not deserve the oxygen of attention. That silence, more than any condemnation, revealed how seriously Johnny Carson took the responsibility of his platform. 3. Jerry Lee Lewis. To the public, Jerry Lee Lewis was electricity. On stage, he was explosive, unpredictable, and thrilling. To audiences, that volatility read as genius. To Johnny Carson, it eventually read as something far less romantic. Carson had always understood performers who lived close to the edge. He had built a career hosting them. But Lewis unsettled him in a different way, not because he was chaotic, but because the chaos appeared selective. Behind the scenes, Carson followed Lewis's career with growing unease. Stories circulated long before they became headlines. Stories not about excess alone, but about behavior that suggested a fundamental disregard for others. Carson did not rush to judgment. He rarely did. But as more details emerged, his admiration cooled into something closer to revulsion. What disturbed Carson wasn't that Lewis was wild, it was that he was calculating. Lewis's public persona leaned heavily on the idea of being out of control, a man driven by impulse and passion. Carson didn't buy it. He believed Lewis knew exactly when to be outrageous and when to be charming. That awareness, paired with a pattern of deeply troubling personal decisions, changed how Carson viewed him entirely. According to staff recollections, Carson came to see Lewis as someone who hid cruelty behind charisma, a performer who understood how to disarm audiences while behaving with astonishing selfishness offstage. Carson reportedly described Lewis as someone who knows the rules and enjoys breaking them when it hurts other people. That distinction mattered. Carson could tolerate arrogance. He could tolerate excess. What he could not tolerate was a lack of conscience. Lewis's personal life, particularly the harm inflicted on people close to him, crossed a line Carson rarely articulated but clearly recognized. When Lewis appeared or was discussed, Carson's tone shifted. The warmth thinned. The indulgence disappeared. There was no public condemnation, no monologue, no pointed joke. Carson didn't need to announce his judgment. He withdrew it. The absence of enthusiasm was telling. Carson stopped treating Lewis as a lovable outlaw and began treating him as someone fundamentally untrustworthy. The couch, once a place of celebration, became neutral ground at best. Carson believed that true danger often wore a smile. Lewis embodied that belief. He was not the explosive mess he pretended to be. He was controlled when it suited him, destructive when it didn't, and indifferent to the fallout. That indifference to Carson was the core issue. In private conversations, Carson reportedly expressed discomfort with how easily audiences forgave Lewis, confusing talent with absolution. To Carson, artistry did not erase responsibility. Being gifted did not excuse being cruel. Unlike figures who spiraled publicly or self-destructed, Lewis continued forward, shielded by success. That continuity troubled Carson more than scandal ever could. Carson didn't call Jerry Lee Lewis evil on air. He didn't have to. He did something far more revealing. He stopped celebrating him. And in a world where Carson's approval was quietly powerful, That withdrawal spoke volumes. 4. Roman Polanski. Johnny Carson admired talent. He championed filmmakers, actors and writers whose work challenged audiences and pushed form forward. But Carson also believed there was a line beyond which achievement no longer mattered. For him, Roman Polanski eventually crossed it. In the early years, Polanski's reputation was defined by his work. Films like Rosemary's Baby positioned him as a serious, innovative director, and Carson initially treated him as such. An artist worth engaging with thoughtfully. There was no hostility, no suspicion, just professional respect. That changed completely after Polanski's criminal case became public. As details emerged, first slowly, then unmistakably, Carson's view hardened. Staff members later recalled that Carson was unusually blunt in private conversations. He did not frame the situation as complicated. He did not indulge in discussions of genius or tragedy. To Carson, however, the facts were sufficient. What disturbed him most was not only the crime, but the response. Polanski fled the United States rather than face sentencing. To Carson, that act spoke louder than any defense. He believed responsibility was inseparable from integrity, and fleeing accountability confirmed something fundamental about Polanski's character. Carson refused to treat the situation as an artistic footnote. Behind the scenes, Carson made it clear he had no interest in rehabilitating Polanski's image or offering sympathetic framing on air. While some in Hollywood debated separation of art from artist, Carson did not. He viewed the conversation itself as a distraction from harm. In Carson's moral framework, this wasn't scandal, it was violation. Yet what made Polanski's case particularly unsettling to Carson was how quickly parts of the industry moved to protect him. Carson had spent decades watching powerful figures evade consequences, and he recognized the pattern immediately. Talent became shield, admiration became excuse. Carson rejected both. He never used his platform to attack Polanski publicly. That was not his style. But he also refused to soften the narrative. No nostalgic praise, no careful reframing, no appeals to complexity. Silence became his stance. Staff later recalled Carson expressing disgust not only at the crime, but at the culture that treated it as negotiable. He believed that some actions forfeited the right to public indulgence. Polanski, in his view, was one of the rare figures for whom that line was unmistakable. Carson's response was not emotional. It was categorical. Polanski was not someone Carson wanted near his audience, not because he was controversial, but because Carson believed giving him space would normalize something that should not be normalized. In an era when Hollywood often protected its own, Carson's refusal stood out quietly. He did not lead campaigns. He did not make speeches. He simply declined to participate. And in Carson's world, that refusal was final. 5. L. Ron Hubbard. Johnny Carson never hosted L. Ron Hubbard on The Tonight Show. That omission was deliberate. In an era when self-help figures, mystics, and pop philosophers cycled regularly through late-night television, Hubbard stood out, not because he was unconventional, but because Carson found him unsettling in a way that went beyond eccentricity. Hubbard was not merely selling ideas. He was building systems of obedience. Carson had spent his career studying performance. He understood charisma, persuasion, and the mechanics of influence. What troubled him about Hubbard was how expertly those tools were deployed, not to entertain or inspire, but to dominate. According to former producers and staff, Carson viewed Hubbard as deeply manipulative. He did not see a sincere spiritual leader or a misunderstood thinker. He saw an authoritarian personality wrapped in the language of self-improvement. Hubbard's certainty, his intolerance of dissent, and his rigid hierarchies raised alarms for Carson long before public scrutiny intensified. Carson believed belief systems revealed themselves not through doctrine, but through behavior. Hubbard demanded loyalty. He punished defection. He positioned himself as the sole arbiter of truth. To Carson, these were not hallmarks of philosophy, they were hallmarks of control. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly referred to Hubbard as someone who didn't want followers, he wanted ownership. That distinction mattered. Carson had little interest in figures who used television not as conversation, but as recruitment. Unlike many controversial figures, Hubbard was not volatile on the surface. He was methodical, organized, strategic, and that calm precision disturbed Carson far more than flamboyant excess ever could. Carson declined opportunities to engage with Hubbard or promote his ideas. He also avoided mocking him publicly. Carson believed ridicule could trivialize real harm. Instead, he chose distance. That distance was intentional. Staff members later recalled Carson expressing concern about how Hubbard treated people who challenged him. Stories of intimidation, surveillance, and retaliation reinforced Carson's view that Hubbard's worldview required submission, not participation. Carson had no interest in legitimizing that dynamic by offering him a platform. In Carson's moral calculus, Hubbard crossed into dangerous territory not because of what he believed, but because of how he enforced belief. Carson had seen enough power concentrated in the wrong hands to recognize the pattern early. This was not about religion versus skepticism, it was about coercion. Carson believed television carried responsibility. Inviting Hubbard onto the couch would not have been neutral. It would have conferred legitimacy, and Carson was unwilling to do that. While other shows flirted with controversy for curiosity or ratings, Carson drew a quiet line. Hubbard remained outside it. In a career defined by openness, this refusal stands out. Carson did not fear Hubbard. He distrusted him. And in Carson's world, distrust was not something to be entertained casually. He didn't argue with Hubbard. He didn't debate him. He simply kept him away. And that decision, made without spectacle or announcement, reveals how seriously Johnny Carson took the power of attention and how carefully he guarded it. 6. Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile never appeared on The Tonight Show. And according to people who worked closely with Johnny Carson, that absence was deliberate. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Savile was a ubiquitous figure on British television. He was eccentric, energetic, and widely praised for his charity work. To many producers, he looked like an easy booking, a recognizable personality with novelty appeal and endless anecdotes. Carson did not see novelty. He saw dissonance. Carson relied heavily on pre-interview briefings and private assessments. He understood how easily charm could be manufactured, how eccentricity could distract, and how generosity could be performed. Savile, in Carson's estimation, triggered unease that was difficult to define but impossible to dismiss. According to former staff members, Carson described Savile as wrong in a way that doesn't show on camera. That phrasing mattered. Carson was not accusing Savile of bad manners or unpredictable behavior. He was responding to something colder, a sense of manipulation beneath the friendliness, or a performance designed not to entertain, but to disarm. Carson had hosted thousands of guests. He trusted his instincts about people who use performance as a form of control. Savile's exaggerated persona, relentless self-promotion, and habit of dominating conversations raised quiet concerns. He shaped rooms around himself. He managed perception aggressively. He did not invite scrutiny. Carson declined. There was no announcement, no explanation. Savile simply never crossed the threshold. In an era when many broadcasters treated eccentric figures as harmless entertainment, Carson made a different calculation. He believed attention conferred legitimacy, and legitimacy carried responsibility. What troubled Carson most, according to later recollections, was Savile's proximity to power paired with his immunity from questioning. Savile cultivated authority through constant visibility. He was everywhere, praised relentlessly, rarely challenged. Carson distrusted that arrangement instinctively. Decades later, after Savile's death, the full extent of his crimes became public, shocking Britain and the world. For those familiar with Carson's quiet refusal, the revelations reframed that instinct. Carson had not known specifics. He had not needed to. He had sensed something incompatible with trust. Carson never claimed prophetic insight. He did not boast about judgment calls. But those who worked closely with him recalled that Savile's name resurfaced in private conversations afterward, not with surprise, but with grim confirmation. This was not intuition as mysticism. Carson believed experience trained perception. He had watched enough performers manipulate audiences, on institutions and goodwill to recognize patterns others overlooked. Savile fit one of those patterns. Carson's response was not confrontation, it was containment. By keeping Savile off the couch, he denied him the validation late-night television uniquely provided. There was no spectacle in the refusal. In Carson's world, the most serious judgment was not criticism, it was exclusion. And in the case of Jimmy Savile, that quiet exclusion remains one of the clearest examples of Johnny Carson choosing responsibility over curiosity. 7. O.J. Simpson. For years, O.J. Simpson embodied a kind of American ease. He was charming, affable, and effortlessly likable. To audiences, he felt safe. To television, he was reliable. Johnny Carson understood that appeal, and for a long time accepted it. That changed irrevocably in the mid-1990s. Now, after the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, Simpson became something entirely different in the public imagination. The trial consumed the country, dividing audiences and saturating television with speculation, performance, and outrage. Carson watched it all closely and with increasing discomfort. What unsettled Carson was not the spectacle. He had lived through plenty of that. What disturbed him was the dissonance between Simpson's public persona and the gravity of what surrounded him. Carson believed television had a responsibility not to trivialize harm. After the criminal trial concluded, there was enormous pressure across media to resume normal treatment of Simpson, to joke about him, reference him lightly, or reintroduce him as a pop culture figure. Carson refused. He would not treat Simpson as a punchline, and he would not offer him warmth, irony, or distance from the seriousness of the case. According to staff accounts, Carson expressed deep unease about Simpson's demeanor in public appearances following the trial. He did not describe rage or instability. He described something colder, a lack of visible remorse, a comfort with performance that felt inappropriate given the circumstances. Carson did not declare guilt on air. That was not his role, but he made his judgment clear through absence and tone. Simpson was no longer someone Carson wanted near the desk, not because of controversy, but because of what Carson perceived as moral vacancy. What disturbed Carson most was how easily the machinery of entertainment seemed ready to move on. Commercials returned, jokes resurfaced. The cultural appetite for levity reasserted itself. So Carson rejected that impulse entirely. In private conversations, Carson reportedly said that some situations demanded gravity and that refusing to provide it was a form of cruelty. Treating Simpson as entertainment again, he believed, risked minimizing irreversible harm. So Carson opted out. There were no invitations, no soft framing, no rehabilitative curiosity. Carson did not believe television should help restore normalcy when normalcy itself felt inappropriate. He viewed that restraint not as punishment, but as responsibility. This was not about legal outcomes. It was about moral tone. Carson had always believed the desk represented something more than conversation. It represented judgment, quiet, implied, but real. Who sat there mattered. Who was welcomed back mattered. In the case of O.J. Simpson, Carson chose distance. And he did not mock him. He did not debate him. He did not repackage him. He simply withdrew recognition. In a medium that often rewards notoriety with attention, that withdrawal was Carson's verdict. 8. Don King. Don King understood television. He understood spectacle, cadence, and how to command attention. To many hosts, that made him compelling. To Johnny Carson, it made him dangerous. King's public persona was flamboyant, towering hair, rapid-fire speech, theatrical confidence. But Carson was less interested in performance than in pattern. And the pattern he saw in King troubled him. Behind the scenes, Carson followed the boxing world closely enough to understand its power dynamics. Promoters were not merely salesmen. They were brokers of access, money, and leverage. King, in Carson's view, embodied the darkest version of that role. He didn't just promote fighters, he controlled them. Staff members later recalled Carson describing King as someone who thrived on fear rather than loyalty. Contracts, threats, whispered consequences. These were not rumors Carson dismissed lightly. He believed King cultivated dependence and used intimidation as a business tool. What unsettled Carson most was how easily charm masked coercion. King could be entertaining on camera. He could tell stories, sell narratives, and frame himself as a larger-than-life success. Carson didn't deny that, but he believed the same skills used to dazzle audiences were used off-camera to dominate people with far less power. Carson did not enjoy hosting figures whose success depended on exploitation. According to staff recollections, Carson was wary of giving King a platform that would allow him to sanitize his reputation through charisma. Late-night television had a way of laundering complexity into likability. Carson was acutely aware of that risk. He also understood something else. Intimidation rarely announces itself. It hides behind enthusiasm. It disguises itself as confidence. King's ease on camera, Carson believed, was not proof of innocence. It was proof of practice. Carson never publicly accused King of crimes on air. That was not his role. But he did not indulge him either. When King appeared or was discussed, Carson's tone remained distant, controlled, and skeptical. The warmth he extended to athletes and entertainers rarely reached King. In private, Carson reportedly referred to King as someone who leaves damage behind him. Not chaos, damage. Once the distinction mattered, chaos could be accidental. Damage implied intent. Carson believed that people who normalized intimidation were corrosive to the culture around them, and he believed television had an obligation not to normalize them further. So Carson kept King at arm's length. No celebratory framing, no heroic mythology, no indulgent banter. In an industry that often mistook power for legitimacy, Carson resisted the confusion. He did not argue with King. He did not debate him. He simply refused to participate in the performance. In Carson's moral calculus, that refusal was deliberate. Because to Carson, true danger was not loud or erratic. It was confident, charming, and utterly indifferent to the cost it imposed on others. 9. Truman Capote. Johnny Carson admired writers. He trusted language. He believed that intellect, given enough time, revealed character. That belief is what made his eventual disillusionment with Truman Capote so gradual and so final. In Capote's early years, Carson treated him with genuine respect. Capote was sharp, witty, and unusually fluent on television. He understood timing. He understood audience. He could be playful without sacrificing intelligence, a rare skill among literary figures. For a time, Carson saw him as proof that serious thought and popular culture did not have to exist in opposition. That image did not survive. As the years passed, Carson watched Capote change, not in style but in ethics. According to those close to Carson, the breaking point came with answered prayers. What Capote framed as radical honesty struck Carson as something else entirely: exploitation. Capote did not merely draw inspiration from real lives. He exposed them. He transformed confidences into material and intimacy into leverage. People who had trusted him found themselves publicly dissected, their private lives repurposed for literary effect. Careers were damaged. Relationships collapsed. Capote appeared unmoved by the fallout. Carson found this deeply unsettling. To him, the issue was not gossip, it was consent. Carson believed there was a fundamental difference between observation and extraction. In Capote's later work, he saw a willingness to sacrifice others without hesitation, so long as the result enhanced the work. Talent, in Carson's view, did not justify that trade. Staff members later recalled Carson describing Capote as someone who had lost the line between insight and cruelty. That distinction mattered. And Carson respected honesty. He did not respect harm disguised as candor. When Capote appeared on The Tonight Show in his later years, Carson's tone shifted noticeably. The warmth faded. The indulgence disappeared. Carson corrected Capote more often, allowed silences to linger, and stopped smoothing over incoherence or provocation. This was not mockery. It was distance. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly expressed sadness more than anger. He believed Capote had chosen destruction of others and of himself as a posture. The substance abuse, the public unraveling, and the bitterness toward former friends reinforced Carson's sense that Capote had become emotionally dangerous. What disturbed Carson most was Capote's lack of remorse. He spoke openly about the damage his work caused, framing betrayal as inevitable. Carson rejected that entirely. When insight without empathy, he believed, was not brilliance. It was threat. Capote was not treated as a villain. Carson did not sensationalize his decline, but he did reach a rare conclusion. Capote had crossed from flawed into harmful, and so Carson stepped away. 10. Howard Hughes. Johnny Carson rarely spoke about Howard Hughes in public. That silence was deliberate. Hughes fascinated America for decades. Aviator, filmmaker, industrialist, recluse. To many, he was a symbol of eccentric genius. To Carson, he represented something far more troubling: power exercised without visibility, accountability, or correction. Carson did not mock Hughes. He did not dismiss him as merely unwell. In private conversations, Carson expressed something closer to unease. He believed Hughes occupied a space where money-insulated behavior, and secrecy replaced scrutiny. What unsettled Carson most was not Hughes's reclusiveness. It was the reach he maintained despite it. Hughes controlled studios, airlines, defense contracts, and media narratives while remaining largely unseen. Carson understood show business well enough to know that invisibility paired with influence was not neutral. It was strategic. Hughes could shape outcomes without appearing to do so, affecting lives at scale while avoiding consequence. Carson believed that kind of power distorted morality. According to staff recollections, Carson described Hughes as someone whose decisions harm people without ever having to face them. Contracts were broken, careers were frozen, properties were seized. People simply disappeared from relevance. Hughes rarely had to explain why. See, Carson had spent his life in front of cameras. He believed exposure created responsibility. Hughes operated in the opposite direction. The more powerful he became, the less visible he allowed himself to be. That imbalance disturbed Carson deeply. Carson declined opportunities to treat Hughes as a quirky legend. He resisted romantic portrayals. When Hughes came up in conversation, Carson avoided fascination and leaned toward skepticism. He believed stories about genius and madness distracted from a simpler truth. Hughes had amassed the ability to alter lives arbitrarily, and he did. Carson was particularly troubled by how fear surrounded Hughes's orbit. Employees, associates, and intermediaries acted as buffers, enforcing his will while protecting him from confrontation. Carson recognized the structure immediately. He had seen similar dynamics in Hollywood executives, just magnified by scale. What made Hughes different was insulation. Hughes did not need approval. He did not need audiences. He did not need explanation. Carson believed that absence of feedback was corrosive. When no one could say no, judgment decayed. Carson did not label Hughes a villain publicly. That would have been too simple. But privately, he categorized Hughes among the most morally troubling figures he had observed. Not because of instability, but because of unchecked authority. In Carson's worldview, danger wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, wealthy, and untouchable. Hughes never appeared on Carson's couch. There was no attempt to humanize him through late-night charm. Carson believed the desk was not a place to soften power that refused accountability. By withholding engagement, Carson issued his judgment without spectacle. He did not fear Hughes. He did not admire him. He did not excuse him. He recognized him. And in a career built on reading people carefully, that recognition mattered. 11. Oliver Reed. Johnny Carson understood excess. He had hosted drinkers, egotists, and volatile performers for decades. What disturbed him about Oliver Reed went beyond indulgence. Carson believed Reed crossed into a different category, one where recklessness became a threat to others. Reed arrived on The Tonight Show already impaired. That much was visible. What Carson perceived beneath the intoxication, however, was something more troubling: indifference. Reed did not seem embarrassed by his condition. He did not attempt correction. He did not appear concerned about consequences. Now, Carson noticed immediately. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly described Reed as someone who didn't care who he took down with him. That distinction mattered. Carson could forgive weakness. He could not forgive disregard. Reed's behavior suggested a willingness to endanger productions, careers, and reputations simply to satisfy impulse. What unsettled Carson most was Reed's awareness. This was not confusion, it was choice. Reed understood the platform he was on. He understood the damage he was causing, and he proceeded anyway. To Carson, that placed Reed beyond the realm of the merely troubled and into something darker, someone whose lack of restraint carried real risk. Carson shut the segment down. That decision was not made lightly. Ending an interview early violated Carson's deepest instincts as a host. But Reed had crossed from embarrassment into liability. Carson believed allowing the spectacle to continue would legitimize it. Afterward, Carson made it clear he wanted no repeat. Reed was not treated as misunderstood. He was treated as unsafe. Carson did not speak about Reed often. When he did, it was with a tone reserved for people who refused responsibility entirely. Reed's self-destruction, in Carson's view, was no longer private. It was contagious. And Carson would not host contagion. Johnny Carson rarely labeled people outright. He preferred restraint to condemnation. But behind the calm exterior was a clear moral framework. These 11 figures unsettled him, not because they were difficult or controversial, but because they represented something deeper: exploitation, manipulation, coercion, or harm without remorse. Where Carson understood the power of attention, he knew who deserved it and who did not. His judgments were rarely spoken aloud. They were expressed through distance, silence, and refusal. And in a career defined by tolerance, those refusals reveal exactly where Johnny Carson believed the line truly was.